Détente and the End of the Cold War, Part 2. There is a Part 1 to this video. Hopefully you've already watched it. So part of why the West won the Cold War was that Western culture was just more appealing. It was more free, more deliciously chaotic comparatively. So communism as it existed in the Cold War was totalitarian. All of them were totalitarian. Free speech and free thinking were heavily controlled by the government, and they were worried, those communist governments, that if they did allow free speech and free thinking, people would complain about poverty, about corruption, about racism, the fact that they wanted to be religious, environmental destruction, degradation, and communist dictators ended up basically creating these like very controlled, very constricted, very bland societies that were not appealing to their own people. And the West itself was also a mess. Like we had our own problems, deep problems, although those problems tended to be problems that showed that we were going to improve and become a better place, and communism did not improve. So, for instance, the West had problems, although these were excellent problems to have, with freedom movements, people of color, the civil rights movement, women, LGBTQ plus people, all of those people demanding equalities, which was difficult for those societies, which were very homophobic and racist and sexist at that time. And those struggles did make the West a mess, but as I said, obviously it's making the West a better place. Drugs were a problem. They were definitely a problem in the 1960s and 1970s, still are. Communists tended to just shoot people who had drugs or some drug problems, so it was more of a Western problem, at least without, if you don't count alcohol, because alcoholism was a real problem in the communist world. But that, was something that was really bad in the West. And the biggest problem with the West was economic inequality. I mean, communism is efficient, or capitalism, excuse me, is efficient. It makes a lot of stuff. It improves its technology really rapidly. Unfortunately, capitalism is very unequal, and it's difficult to get capitalism to treat all people well so that everybody shares the benefits equally, which of course is the whole point of communism. Communism was great at making everyone equally lower middle class or rich poor, which is nothing anybody wants to be. But capitalism had problems in that it was unequal, and there was a lot of pressure from poor people against their own governments. So, not meaning to say in any way, shape, or form that the capitalist world or the Western world was perfect. It was also being torn apart. But like I said, things were getting better there. And in the end, the West was where everyone wanted to be. I mean, communist people, when they could get to the West or find out about the West, were aware of how interesting the culture was, that things were, that the kind of poverty in the West was often richer than the kind of equality in the communist world. And so, the communist world was behind there. And here's a kind of caricature of the difference between the two cultures. So in the communist bloc on the right side there, you have the guy who's since become a meme, the Trololo guy. And it's, kind of a joke, but also true that Eastern or communist culture tended to be very limited, very controlled, and definitely aimed at the common people. The problem was there was kind of like one assumed common people and one culture for everyone, because communism was so afraid of there being chaos or something out of control that they would not be able to censor properly. And so communist culture was not that much fun. Whereas on the left side there, you have the total, colorful, chaotic weirdness of Western culture, showing, advances for all sorts of people, and also just like creativity and giving the people what they wanted, as opposed to telling the people who they were and what they needed to have, which is what communist culture tended to do. And interestingly, one of the things that led to the end of the Cold War, although it was a slow end, was the rise of the fact that people kind of got tired of the Cold War on both sides. And so by 1969, détente became the order of the day. And détente is a French word, and it's just the lowering of tensions, or the willingness to get along. And so the US and NATO, the Communist Chinese, and the Warsaw Pact all came to the realization that the early Cold War kind of brinksmanship, the like going to the edge of destruction, had been dangerous. And it was also just counterproductive. These nations realized like they weren't going to be able to make the other people go away, so they should probably clean up their act at home. And that meant ramping down the Cold War tensions. Proxy wars did continue, and like the Vietnam War happens during this period, and Afghanistan's going to happen, all kinds of wars. But the direct, like serious day-to-day threatening between the communist and capitalist world did kind of ramp down in the 1970s, and for a lot of reasons. Primarily because the communists were having a lot of trouble keeping up at all, and the West knew that, and therefore we were a lot less threatened, and the communist world kind of had to step back because they realized, like, if we can't figure out how to make refrigerators and telephones and make our people stop hating us, we're going to lose anyway. And so Détente was a way for the Soviets to stop spending so much money on their militaries and try and clean their act up at home. And the Chinese were doing the same exact thing. And so that kind of lowered the tension and made the whole threat of the Cold War, at least in the 1970s, lessened. And the second slide on Détente here is that Western social issues are one of the reasons why the United States, in particular, but also France and Britain and places like that, were less interested in bothering with the Cold War because they had issues at home, like the Civil Rights Movement, and why should we not clean that up first before we go fight with the Soviets, who we can't fight with anyway because of mutually assured destruction? So the United States, like the communists, had issues that it had to deal with, giving rights to black people, women, LGBTQ plus people, and all other people of color. And the other thing that was going on is the 1970s were a terrible time economically worldwide. Basically, there was this big growth period after World War II and as part of the Cold War, and the 1970s saw that all, as it often does, go into reverse, and the inequalities of capitalism had become a real problem by the 1970s. During the boom period after World War II, kind of everybody got better, but by the 1970s that stopped being true so much, and there was a lot of tension around economic issues in addition to the tensions around social issues, and so the West, like the East, or like the communists, was distracted and felt like the Cold War was less important than the problems going on at home. And then you began to see the rise of things like Muslim nationalism, Jordanian nationalism, Algerian nationalism, Syrian nationalism, Egyptian nationalism, and those nations wanting freedom, independence from colonialism. The next unit's all about decolonization. And there was a series of wars between these Arab nations and the Israelis, which severely disrupted oil markets throughout the world. The Arab nations embargoed oil, driving up fuel costs at a time when oil was the world fuel. And all of that had nothing to do with the Cold War. And so in the 1970s, there were just a lot of things going on that had nothing to do with the Cold War. And countries began to think, Western countries and the Soviet Union and China began to think, this isn't the most important thing anymore, communism and capitalism. Like, we're that and we're going to stay that, so let's focus on everything else. And obviously that made things less tense, at least in the Cold War sense. They had other tensions to deal with. And then this is the actual definition of détente. So détente is a French word from release from tension, meaning release from tension. It is the name given to the period of improved relations between the United States and the Soviet Union that began tentatively or gingerly, or just a little, in 1971, and took decisive form when President Richard M. Nixon visited the Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party, Leonid I. Brezhnev, in Moscow in May 1972. That's Brezhnev on the left, Nixon on the right there in that picture. Nixon also went to China and eased relations with Mao Zedong and the Communist Chinese. Nixon was a total war criminal, like bombed Laos illegally, kept the Vietnam War going, which was a terrible proxy war, lied to the American people, committed all kinds of crimes. He's a horrible human. But he did make the world safer through détente. And the 1970s and 1980s were when you really saw it all come to an end. The West had pulled very far ahead in a lot of ways, and communism just began to implode. And that kind of began with the Chinese. The Chinese moved towards more market-based economy, not exactly capitalism, but close. State capitalism would be a good way of explaining it. During the 1970s, under the guy you see there at the top right, Deng Xiaoping, and Deng realized that, basically communism was not going to survive as an economic system. It could survive as a political system in his mind, and so that's what he set up. China remains a dictatorship under the Communist Party. They limit a lot of things, religion, speech. It is not a friendly place for democracy in China today. Economically, however, China's doing great. And that is the thing that Deng Xiaoping began. And it's a very strange system where you have a communist government with a capitalist economy, but that is kind of what modern China is like. And Ronald Reagan, the guy you see in the Oval there, was elected to the presidency of the United States in 1980. And he also helped end the Cold War by basically being a Cold Warrior. He abandoned Détente and ramped up U.S. weapons spending really aggressively, and began to use the U.S. military again in very Cold War kind of ways. He actually put the world at a great amount of risk of nuclear war again. And in doing that, it kind of forced the Soviets to try and keep up. So the Soviets had to ramp up their economics, or ramp up their military spending, start trying to keep people in the military again, all these things that they really couldn't afford. And by this point, the Soviet economy just began to fall apart. They couldn't produce things, their people hated them, and even within the Soviet Communist Party, there were a ton of people who were like, this isn't working. And Ronald Reagan did kind of shove them to the edge by making the world a more dangerous place. And in the Warsaw Pact nations, like Poland and Bulgaria and Romania and East Germany, people began to rebel, or at least talk about rebelling against Soviet domination and against their own governments. And those rebellions began to stick. They weren't all just shot down and put into prison anymore. And so that kind of weakened communism. Communism seemed to be losing its nerve in the 1980s, in addition to losing its money and economic system. The Soviets really did themselves no help by invading Afghanistan in 1979 to try and prop up a communist government there. That was kind of their Vietnam, and in an economy and a government already discredited and broke, waging a major losing war is not a good idea. So Afghanistan helped destroy Soviet communism, and kind of the final, nightmarish nail in the coffin of Soviet communism was the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl in, I think it's 1986. I don't remember the year exactly. And the Chernobyl nuclear disaster not only took out a large part of the Ukraine, didn't like blow it up or anything, just made it radioactively untouchable for 1,000 years. It also poisoned a lot of, the air and things like that. Not permanently, but like radiation poison all over the place throughout Western Europe. And the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl made Soviet science kind of, which was already sort of a joke, an obvious joke to everyone. And the fixing of Chernobyl, or the attempted fixing, which actually they couldn't even do until communism was over, was just bizarrely expensive. And the Soviet state was trying to fight a war in Afghanistan, trying to keep up with the Americans, and Chernobyl just was, way too much money for them to continue on. And so communism just began to unravel. And communist failures led to them to try to reform, and those reforms ended up destroying communism from within. So the guy there at the top right is Mikhail Gorbachev, who is a very nice guy and the last leader of Russia. And Gorbachev was kind of a new generational leader. He took over in '85 and began to try and make Russia capable of keeping up with the West. And he had two big ideas, both of which were nice ideas. The first one was Glasnost, which was openness. So he was going to allow the Soviet Union to talk. Like, he wasn't going to censor everybody, he wasn't going to shoot people in the back of the head if they said the wrong thing. And the idea there was to create a culture capable of being as appealing as Western culture, a culture that, where scientists could talk to each other and therefore technology would advance. So Glasnost was meant to fix problems that had been caused by totalitarianism. And then copying the Chinese, Gorbachev also wanted to see perestroika, or economic restructuring. And so he basically saw what the Chinese had been doing under Deng Xiaoping and realized, like, the Soviet Union also had to have market-based economic systems. The problem for the Soviets was, in some ways, and the Chinese have always felt that the problem was they should have only done perestroika and no glasnost. But Gorbachev did believe in more freedom, to his credit, unlike the Chinese. And the problem was that once the Soviets could talk, the citizens, and not be shot or arrested or whatever, they basically just spent all their time complaining about the failures of communism, and that helped communism fall. And it all kind of began to, like, the moment where, in my life, because I lived through this, I literally took a nap and the Cold War was going on, and then after my nap, the Berlin Wall was going down and the Cold War was in the process of falling apart. So on November 9th, 1989, while I was taking a nap, the Berlin Wall came down. And this had been this symbol of communism, symbol of Soviet domination, symbol of totalitarianism. And there was a bad radio communication that basically said, like, East Germans were going to be allowed to visit West Germany on the next day or whatever it was. It was kind of an unclear statement. And that's really kind of what ended the Berlin Wall and began the end of communism, was just a bad press release. What happened was East Germans basically had heard this report, and the guards at the border had heard the report. And so when East German citizens just began to cross the border, the guards didn't shoot them. And so more and more East Germans just started to flood across the borders, wandering around West Berlin, wandering into Western Germany and in other places, and the guards didn't do anything. And then a lot of the guards began to cross the border themselves and just wander around it. They weren't like moving there or anything, they were just visiting, and mostly just they were shocked they weren't being shot. And then people in East Berlin began to take the wall apart, literally by hand, like pulling out the barbed wire. People grabbed some sledgehammers and started pounding down the wall, and the guards just looked at it and were like, are we shooting people? Nope. And so the guards just disappeared, and the Berlin Wall came down. And Gorbachev did not order the Soviet military in to make this stop. And that failure of will of the Communist Party, the moment where they stopped shooting their own people, is where communism really died. It was just a question of whether, how long it would take for it to fully unravel. So for the next year, throughout the 1990s, the Soviet Union itself began to disintegrate. It was a Russian-dominated federation of Soviet states, and the other states within the USSR, which are now independent countries, Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, the Stans, etc., those countries split off and became independent nations again. And by 1991, even the Soviet Union itself had abandoned communism. Communist hardliners, not Gorbachev, but other people, tried a coup to take over the government from more democratic Soviet or Russians now, and the Russians were like, nah. And so that coup just fizzled out, and that was the end of communism in Russia, and Chinese communism had already shifted into a very different thing, and that was basically the end of the Cold War. It kind of ended on November 9th, 1981, but it officially ended in 91 when the Soviet Union totally disintegrated and Russia became just another country.